I'd like to dedicate this talk to the women who spend time in Ireland's Magdalene Laundries, including those who have died. I wonder, can you remember what you were doing when you were 15? In the 1950s, a girl called Bridget was sent by the nuns running the school she lived in to work in a hospital. She was 15. She helped on the wards and did odd jobs. She didn't get money into her pocket, but the nuns in charge said that they were keeping her wages safe for her. One Saturday in September 1958, Bridget was sent to the hospital morgue to lay out the body of a patient who had died. And while she was there, the porter came in to talk to her. They were just having silly conversation, but the next thing Bridget knew, a nun was there trying to get rid of her. She remembers her shouting, "You, out," to her. The next day, after Mass, when Bridget was changing the flowers on the altar, a nun came into the chapel and called out to her. And then another nun came in. Bridget says that she just felt that something was going to happen to her. She felt that the nuns were going to grab her, and so she made a run for it. The nuns did grab her, and they bundled her into a car that was waiting outside. As they were driving away from the hospital, Bridget was crying and asking, "Where are you taking me? What are you doing to me?" "You'll see, they answered. And then they said, "You're going to the Magdalene Laundry." Bridget doesn't remember much more of that day, although she does remember the big green door of the Magdalene Laundry and the uniform she was given to wear when she went through it. She says she didn't ask why she was there. "You didn't dare ask a question," she says. "You did not dare." But she was told before long, although it didn't turn out to be the case, that she'd be there for life. I believe that what happened to Bridget was worse than being put in prison. I'm sure that in prison in those days, food was probably awful and the conditions were no doubt harsh, but at least those who ended up in prison would have known why they were there and how long their incarceration would last. The same cannot be said for the girls and women who ended up in Magdalene Laundries. Ireland's Magdalene Laundries were institutions attached to Catholic convents in cities and towns throughout the country. And the available survivor testimony tells the following story of what happened there. Locked in behind their high walls and barred windows, girls and women lived in silence. They were under orders not to speak except to pray. And on their first day in a laundry, their hair was cut, their clothes were taken away and replaced with a uniform, and their names were dispensed with and replaced with a saint's name and a number. If the girl had a home, there was little contact with it. Letters out were censored or intercepted, and there was no education. The girls and women were put to work at least 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. They washed laundry, made handcrafts for sale, and did other manual labour for no pay. The laundry they washed included state linen from state institutions such as prisons and schools, and even Áras an Uachtaráin. And when John F. Kennedy came to Ireland in 1963, he and Jackie were given a present of a beautiful Limerick lace christening robe. Limerick lace that had been made in the Limerick Magdalene Laundry. From the founding of the state in 1922 until 1996, when the last Magdalene Laundry closed in Dublin, well over 10,000 girls and women were sent there, and their ages varied hugely. Some were as young as 9 years of age. The reasons they went there varied as well. Some had been abused, perhaps by a family member, and in order to avoid shame and to protect the perpetrator, the victim was sent away. Others were considered trouble by their families, by the nuns who ran the state-licensed residential schools where they lived, or by the local priest or the local Garda. Some were sent by the courts or probation officers as an alternative to a prison sentence. Others were there because they had got themselves pregnant. These would have included girls and women who had fallen foul of the state policy that second-time unmarried mothers, so-called second offenders, would be sent to Magdalene Laundries to ensure that they could not commit the same crime again. But whatever the reasons that the girls and women ended up in the laundries, and whatever the differences between them, once they were there, they tended to face the same regime. Refusal to work was not an option, and punishments included deprivation of meals, solitary confinement, physical chastisement, hair cutting, verbal abuse, or humiliation rituals. Some of the girls and women managed to escape out a door or a gate left open momentarily. in the back of a laundry van or by scaling the wall. But many who did were captured and returned by the police, and escape was punished, and often by removal to a different Magdalene laundry. So how long would this nightmare continue? Well, that was the thing. The girls and women didn't know. Some were released after months, but more often it was after years or even a decade. The electoral records for 2 Dublin Magdalene laundries show that 63% of women registered in 1955 were still present 9 years later in 1964. If girls and women did leave, it was usually without any warning, and some never did. They died in Magdalene laundries, or they continued to live in the care of the religious orders responsible for the laundries today. Because of the recent publicity, we may think of Magdalene laundries as uniquely Irish and Catholic, but in fact their roots were neither. In the 18th and 19th centuries, they operated not just in Ireland, but also in the UK and in other European countries, as well as in North America and Australia. They were run by religious and non-religious groups as part of the emergence of the so-called rescue movement. But in the early 1900s, as they were beginning to close down elsewhere in Europe, in Ireland, they were getting going with a renewed vigour. They were becoming places for the new Catholic state and society to hide away girls and women considered in danger of giving the country a bad name. This idea that girls and women were a problem to society and that if they ended up in Magdalene laundries, it was basically their fault, was quite literally beaten into them. The words thrown at them inside the Magdalene laundries and the punishing, dehumanising regime they were forced into ingrained a stigma and a sense of shame that many of the women live with today. And so, over the years, as many did leave and establish independent lives, almost none of the women spoke of their experience or demanded to know how this could have been allowed to happen. So how then did we end up apologising for what happened to girls and women in Magdalene laundries? Should we have done so? And have we gone far enough in our efforts to make amends for the past? Well, let's have a look at how the apology evolved in order to find out. In 2010, following revelations about unmarked graves and gaps in records and some survivor campaigns, numerous Irish politicians and the Irish Human Rights Commission were calling on the government to investigate the laundries and ensure reparation. But it wasn't until 2011 at the United Nations that the government was put in a position for the first time really where it had to respond. When a country signs the UN Human Rights Convention, it has to appear every few years before a committee of experts, and those experts monitor how well the country is complying with its convention obligations. In 2011, the UN Committee Against Torture was examining Ireland for the first time, and a voluntary group that I was involved with, Justice for Magdalenes, had submitted a report to the committee containing testimonies of Magdalene laundry survivors. We were calling on the committee to request that the government apologise to the women, and we wanted that apology to include a commitment to ensure full reparation. A delegation of 10 Irish civil servants was in Geneva to defend Ireland's human rights record. And when they were asked whether Ireland would investigate the Magdalene laundries and ensure redress, the Irish response was that the institutions were private and not really the responsibility of the state, and that the vast majority of women had gone there voluntarily. This didn't square with direct evidence I'd gathered from women who'd spent time in laundries, nor did it square with evidence other members of Justice for Magdalenes had collected in the state archives. The UN felt the same way, and shortly after that meeting, it made a formal recommendation to Ireland to immediately institute an independent and thorough investigation, to prosecute perpetrators, and to ensure full redress, including as full rehabilitation for the women as possible. Following this recommendation, the government did set up an inquiry into state involvement with the laundries, and it found that they were not wholly private institutions. The state was involved in sending many of the girls and women there. The police were involved in returning escapees. The state had inspected the laundries as factory premises, and several government departments had held laundry contracts with the nuns. And so, in February 2013, following this inquiry and having met personally with a number of the women, the Taoiseach An Tánaiste issued a state apology to survivors of Magdalene laundries, and they promised that the government would provide some measures of redress. There is no doubt but that apology was seismic. The women in the Dáil that evening did feel heard, and many spoke of a weight beginning to lift with that acknowledgement that they were not at fault for what had happened, and that a grave injustice had been done to them. It was absolutely the right thing to do. But it was a tough road to get there, and arguments are sometimes made in respect of taking this route or against taking this route in respect of so-called historic abuse. Some people say simply, this all happened in the past, and shouldn't we be focusing our energies on problems people have in society today? Well, my response to that is that the Magdalene Laundries was a continuing abuse. The effects were ongoing. In fact, over time, poverty, physical ill health, isolation, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder can get worse as they go unaddressed. Another issue that continues as long as there is no reparation is the silence that engulfs victims of so-called historic abuse. Women who gave their testimonies to the UN in 2011 were among the first to break the silence surrounding Ireland's Magdalene Laundries abuse. It wasn't that the institutions were a secret, in fact it was the opposite. But people had been told, the girls and women in there had effectively been told through the knowledge of the society and state and through the involvement of its guardians of civil rights, that they didn't have the same rights as everyone else and that no one would listen if they tried to complain. So that continuing silence continued to deny dignity to the survivors today. What then of a second argument that's sometimes made in respect of so-called historic abuse? This happened in different times, everyone had it harder then, and it's really unfair to apply today's standards to judge the past. Since the 1930s, Ireland has had obligations under international law to prevent, criminalise and suppress this kind of behaviour. And our own constitution, which we adopted in 1937, guarantees that the state will respect, defend and vindicate the personal rights of the citizen. We ratified the European Convention on Human Rights in 1953, and along with the protection against slavery and forced labour, these instruments outlawed torture and other ill treatment, as well as a whole host of human rights violations that the girls and women in Magdalene Laundries suffered. So then there's sometimes a third argument that's made against apologising for so-called historic abuse. This would all just be too expensive, we'll end up opening a Pandora's box. To that I would simply say that the cost of accepting responsibility for past abuse by the state can be far outweighed by the benefit that it brings to society for the future. Yes, the Magdalene Laundries tell us some terrible truths about our past, and the truth of the mother and baby homes will do the same. But we can't afford to let the opportunity pass to put these wrongs right. Women and girls and people who find themselves in vulnerable situations cannot afford for us to ignore what we're being told about where we've come from and about what our state and society have done to people and have allowed to happen in the not so distant past. We have no guarantee that rights and dignity will be respected in the future if we don't demand accountability for what happened in the past and institutional reform where necessary. So in apologising to the women who were in Magdalene Laundries and in promising that the government would provide redress, did the government get it just right, or do we still have things to learn? Well, there are some matters outstanding. The state has never instituted an independent, thorough investigation into allegations of abuse in the laundries and lines of responsibility for that abuse. All it investigated in 2011 was state involvement with the Magdalene Laundries, and all records that inquiry received from the religious orders were returned to the nuns at the end of the inquiry, and all copies were destroyed. There are numerous women lying in unmarked and wrongly marked graves around Ireland, and none of the nuns have issued any apology or any form of reparation to the women. The redress on offer from the state is ex gratia, which means that it's given as a gift or as a favour, not as of right and not as compensation for any wrongdoing. As a result, the financial payments and healthcare on offer are small, and the women have been required to sign away all of their legal rights against the state in order to benefit from these bits of redress. Even before this waiver came into the picture, access to the courts was next to impossible for women who'd been in Magdalene Laundries. There are a number of factors for this, not least of which are the continuing effects of the abuse, but also a lack of legal aid, a statute of limitations which is no exception in the interests of justice, the risk of huge cost orders being sought by defendants in court cases, and a severe lack of access to evidence, not just because the nuns' archives are private, but also because the women's names were changed when they were in Magdalene Laundries. And so if they did get out, it was very difficult for them to find each other afterwards. And finally, in terms of gaps in our approach to reparation, we have the ongoing response that the government is now giving the UN since 2013 when it's been asked whether there will be any further investigation. In repeated written correspondence to the UN, the government now says that there is no evidence of systematic torture or criminal treatment having occurred in the Magdalene Laundries, and therefore it will not be investigating further. Well, I respectfully suggest that such evidence is readily available to anyone who goes looking for it. And I think we have to ask what kinds of ill treatment and what crimes might be slipping through the net today if government officials refuse to acknowledge the gravity of what happened in the Magdalene Laundries. So my message is really that we cannot ignore the past if we want to be proud of the future. The testimonies that Magdalene survivors share with us are shocking, and they bring us face to face with the worst of what we have been, hopefully reminding us of what we never ever want to be again. But even our gaps in reparation to date call on us to consider how we are still capable of silencing and keeping out of sight those who are not us, who we have marginalised, who we have stigmatised. The least we owe to women who spend time in Magdalene Laundries, whose experiences continue to affect their lives and their children's lives today, is to ask ourselves this: who are the people behind high walls today who we are denying dignity and basic freedoms to? And who are the people we have silenced? The past has to be our guiding light, showing us what we need to be sensitive to on our journey ahead. Thank you.